We are living through a digital revolution. A super-connected world in which technology engulfs every aspect of our lives. Since the end of the Second World War, humanity has been on a relentless pursuit of innovation and technological progress. The proportion of people living in extreme poverty has dropped from almost 3/4 in 1950 to less than an eighth today. Of course, this rapid advancement doesn't just come out of nowhere, and one of the key drivers was the microprocessor. The ability to shrink an entire computer to a chip the size of a finger has allowed for the mass adoption of both home and mobile computers. They have also had far-reaching implications, helping to advance every industry, from manufacturing, finance, retail, to healthcare. The last 75 years has seen computer technology grow at a truly incredible rate, from early vacuum tube machines to the birth of home computers. From the multimedia madness of the 1990s to the multicore mindset of the 2000s and 2010s. And finally, what lays ahead? To understand how all this came about, we need to go back to the very beginning of digital electronics and look at how early post-war computers were designed. In 1945, with Allied victory imminent, it could have easily been assumed that the military use of computer technology would subside, leaving the endeavour to have a purely academic role. However, the slow emergence of the bitter rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States meant that this was far from the case. Indeed, the first digital computer, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, or ENIAC for short, was used by the United States Army for calculating firing tables for artillery, and later for research into the hydrogen bomb. Outperforming mechanical computers by a factor of 1,000, ENIAC was a revolution in computer technology. Press articles at the time reference how it could vastly outperform existing computers. The US Army was so proud of it, they even used it in their own recruitment advertisements. Overall, it was met with a huge critical acclaim, despite being challenging to program for. The inventors of ENIAC, John Mauchly and John Eckert, proposed a successor shortly after, called EDVAC, or Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer. Unlike ENIAC, which used a decimal representation for numbers, EDVAC used a binary representation, making data storage much more compact. Mauchly and Eckert were joined by mathematician John von Neumann, who wrote an influential report on the EDVAC, detailing how the computer could be extended by storing the programs alongside the data, rather than having the two in separate parts of memory. This idea would be known as the von Neumann architecture, which virtually every microprocessor has since been built on. Britain's loss of superpower status in the early 20th century meant that its efforts were far more research focused than in America. The Manchester Baby, developed a couple of years after ENIAC, was the first computer to be equipped with random access memory, meaning it could store programs alongside data. This was achieved by using a modified set of 4 Williams CV1131 CRT monitors. The Baby was slow, even for the time, but its use of random access memory was pioneering, and it would lay the groundwork for the Ferranti Mark I, the world's first commercially available computer. During development of the Baby, another computer, called the EDSAC, was being developed at the University of Cambridge. The EDSAC hardware was not as technologically advanced as the Baby, featuring only serial memory, but nonetheless correctly implemented the von Neumann architecture and had a far more advanced instruction set. Featuring 14 instructions compared to the Baby's 7, it allowed for easier software development, particularly later in its life. One such example was OXO, an implementation of tic-tac-toe, which is widely considered to be the first video game ever created. It was becoming increasingly clear that the scientific and commercial applications of computers would far outstrip the military use of the mid to late 1940s. By 1954, 95% of computers were used for non-military purposes. Despite their increased use, there were still limitations preventing wider adoption of computers. The defining characteristic for all these early machines was the use of vacuum tubes, or valves, for their main processing elements. Vacuum tubes were unreliable, hot, power-hungry, and heavy. Even a small computer like the Manchester Baby weighed in excess of a ton. The solution was the transistor. The first transistor was manufactured at the Great Bell Labs in 1947. It performed the same job as a vacuum tube, but could be smaller, more reliable, and less power-hungry due to its lack of an electron beam. The first computer to use these was the Manchester transistor computer, the great-grandson of the Manchester Baby. It used 250 transistors, consumed only 150 watts of power, and in the shadow of vacuum tube domination, seemed like a miracle. There was a problem, however. These early transistors were simply too difficult to mass produce and scale, limiting their potential. There were attempts to rectify this problem, using electric fields to control the current, compared to the more traditional method of a direct terminal. This proved difficult though, and little success was made over several years. This was until engineer Mohammed Atalla proposed to cover the silicon wafer with a thin layer of silicon dioxide, which allowed the electric field to more easily pass through the silicon. This process led to the creation of the metal oxide silicon field effect transistor, or MOSFET, in 1959, a transistor with high manufacturability and extremely low power cost. MOSFETs made it possible to develop high-density integrated circuits, which allowed for cheaper and smaller systems, thus drastically increasing adoption numbers. Early MOSFET machines, such as the IBM System 360 family, used a hybrid interconnect circuit approach, combining integrated circuits with traditional electronic components. The System 360 was particularly influential due to IBM's decision to separate the system architecture from the implementation. This meant that all computers in the family, from the cheap Model 30 to the expensive Model 75, could run the same software, a concept that would become widely accepted in the industry. Its successor, the System 370, made full use of monolithic integrated circuits. The adoption of these integrated circuits created a new type of computer entirely: the mini-computer. These systems were scaled-down versions of large mainframe computers, designed to provide computing power to organisations who wanted to use computers, but couldn't afford or justify a large mainframe. Largely accepted as the first commercial mini-computer, the DEC PDP-5 was 1/5 the price and 1/4 the weight of the PDP-1 released 4 years earlier. It was less powerful, featuring only 12-bit memory compared to the 18-bit larger PDP machines, but it was hugely successful, selling more than 1,000 units. This entry point was continually lowered throughout the early 70s, allowing even more widespread adoption. The Data General Nova, with its 200 kHz clock speed and 8K of RAM, cost just $8,000 and was one of the most popular minicomputers of the decade. Some, however, knew that the idea of miniaturization could be taken to even more extremes. The first use of a microprocessor was in the F-14 Tomcat fighter jet and was developed by Garrett AI Research. The company was asked by the US Navy to build a flight computer that could compete with the electromechanical system that was being used during development. The processor created to do this took up 1/20th the space of the existing system and was much more reliable. Impressed by its capabilities, the Navy used this chip in all early F-14s, but all information regarding its development was classified until 1997, so its effects on the wider industry are little, if any. The story of the first commercial microprocessor involved Japanese company Buzzicom, who were developing a range of programmable calculators but were struggling to produce the chipset required. The company contacted Intel, who were large producers of computer memory for mainframe and minicomputers, and asked whether they could produce a 7-chip design for their calculator. Intel accepted, and project engineer Ted Hoff proposed that this could be reduced to 4 chips to lower costs. Hoff, not being a chip designer, moved on to other projects, and was succeeded by Italian engineer Federico Fagin, whom Intel had hired from Fairchild Semiconductor. While working at Fairchild, Fagin invented a new transistor technology called a self-aligned gate. This allows for the gate of the transistor to have a much smaller overlap with the source and drain regions by automatically generating it within the mask process. Removing this bottleneck in transistor design meant that performance could easily be increased when moving to a smaller lithography. Fairchild were reluctant to adopt this technology, so when Fagin moved to Intel, he immediately put it to use in the Buzzicom project. This led to the creation of the Intel 4004, which was delivered to Buzzicom in 1971. The company would go on to sell more than 100,000 4004 powered calculators. The world's first commercial microprocessor was born, and a new era of computing was about to begin. So the year is 1971. While microprocessors were starting to be seen in calculators, many had seen how MOSFETs had given rise to the mini-computer and wondered whether microprocessors could be used to make an all-new type of computer. A home computer. One such person was former NASA engineer Gus Roach, who set up a company in 1968 called Computer Terminal Corporation, CTC, to manufacture terminals for mainframes and mini-computers. Roach was determined to produce a personal computer, one that was small enough to fit on a desk, but could perform more work than acting just as a terminal. His designs highlighted the need of a single 8-bit microprocessor, the CTC 1201, rather than a more traditional approach of a collection of TTL logic chips. There was just one problem. At the time, no one had ever manufactured one. Roach knew this, so approached 2 chipmakers to ask if they could manufacture the microprocessor. One of these was Texas Instruments, who were a large producer for integrated circuits and logic chips. The other was Intel, who mainly produced memory chips. Texas Instruments attempted to produce the chip, but it suffered from reliability problems, and thus development was not continued. Intel, who were in the early days of developing the 4004, didn't see much point to the project. For them, memory was a far bigger priority. Nonetheless, they decided to take on the project and got to work implementing CTC's design. Initial progress was good, but it suffered delays, and Intel could not meet CTC's time schedules. As a result, CTC decided to abandon the single processor design in favour of a multiple chip approach. Intel continued working on the chip, however, and a year later released it as the Intel 8008, the world's first 8-bit microprocessor. Since the 8008 design was based off of CTC specifications, their computer, dubbed the Datapoint 2200, was completely instruction compatible with the Intel 8008, despite not using the processor. The 8008 was soon replaced with the 8080, which improved compatibility with existing TTL chips, had a much higher clock speed, and included a larger 16-bit address bus. This caught the attention of calculator manufacturer MITS, who had used the 4004 processor in some of its designs. Ed Roberts, the company's founder, knew that the 8080 was powerful enough to be used in a home computer, but the chip's high price meant that it wasn't commercially viable to do so. As one of Intel's largest customers, Roberts was able to negotiate the price down from $350 to $75 per unit. This led to the creation of the Altair 8800, generally considered the first commercially successful personal computer. The 8800 was popular with a generation of computer scientists and engineers who had learned computer programming at college but no longer had any hardware to use. Several other home computers followed suit, and the chip also appeared in early arcade games such as Tato's Space Invaders. Soon after, more designs appeared on the market. The Motorola 6800 was released just 4 months after the 8080 and saw use in several early home computers. Motorola had been a huge player in developing transistor-powered electronics, and were confident that their chip would be successful. However, poor decisions by management led most of the design team to walk out around the time of its release. The team, led by engineers Chuck Peddle and Bill Mensch, would join a small semiconductor company called MOS Technology, who are best known for creating the processor for Atari's Pong. They got to work by taking the 6800 design and removing the features that were deemed unnecessary in order to drive costs down. They removed one of the accumulators, simplified the memory bus, and shrank the instruction set by 25%. Another dramatic cost saving was achieved by modifying the masking process in the silicon to significantly improve yields. This allowed MOS to have a defect rate of less than 30% compared to the 70% rate of competitor foundries. The result was the MOS Technology 6501 and 6502, first shown at the Westcon 75 trade show in San Francisco. The 6501 was pin compatible with the Motorola 6800, whereas the 6502 was a modification of the 6501 design with an on-chip clock oscillator. The result of the cost saving meant that the 6502 could be sold for just $25 compared to the $175 of the 6800 and the $350 of the Intel 8080. The news was covered in great detail by the technology press, and the product was soon in high demand. However, Motorola were furious with the 6501's compatibility with its pin layout, and sued MOS Technology, citing patent infringement. MOS, being a small company, settled with Motorola and stopped selling the 6501. But this wasn't an issue, since the 6502 was far more popular, and Motorola made no such demands regarding that chip. In fact, Motorola knew that the 6502 would be successful regardless. 2 months after the chip was released, they reduced the cost of the 6800 from $175 to $69. 9 months later, it was dropped again to $35. But it was too late. Everyone knew the 6502 was king. The chip was used in a whole host of early home computers, including the Apple II, Commodore PET and VIC-20, Atari 400 and 800, and the BBC Micro. It also found success in the emerging home video game market, powering the Atari 2600, the Atari Lynx, the TurboGrafx, and the NES. Despite the success, the legal battles with Motorola had bled the company of funds, and so they were taken over by Commodore in late 1976. Commodore would fully utilise MOS Technologies' expertise with the Commodore 64, which used a lightly modified 6502 chip, the 6510. The 6502 had massively disrupted the market with its high performance and low cost, but it soon faced competition of its own. The head engineer of the Intel 8080 project, Federico Fajan, soon left the company after its completion and started Zilog Microcomputers with fellow Intel engineers. The team took the 8080 design and added several improvements, a whole host of new instructions, reduced the number of support chips required, and introduced new indexing registers that made repeated execution faster. This chip was released as the Zilog Z80, and while its intended use was in embedded systems, it was soon widely adopted in the home computer market. The chip was featured in the Amstrad CPC, various MSX computers, the Radio Shack TRS-80, and the Sinclair ZX80, 81, and Spectrum. Like the 6502, the Z80 also found its fair share of success in the video game industry, powering the ColecoVision, Sega Master System, and Sega Game Gear. In addition to home systems, the Z80 was the go-to processor for the emerging video arcades. It was the chip that powered Donkey Kong, Galaxian, Galaga, Pac-Man, Mario Bros, Frogger, and Berserk. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The Z80's success would not come from its use in home computers or video games. It would come from software. The Z80 was the de facto processor to run CP/M, the world's first successful cross-platform operating system. CP/M was originally built for the Intel 8080, but being fully compatible and cheaper, the Z80 was the obvious choice. Due to the cross-platform nature, CP/M quickly gained a large software library, which made it the dominant operating system in the late 1970s and early 1980s. One such example was WordStar, one of the earliest word processors to gain commercial success. Its "what you see is what you get" interface gave it a clear advantage over existing fully text-based word processors. Another example was Microsoft's Multiplan, an early spreadsheet application that would become Microsoft Excel 3 years later. In fact, Microsoft were a key developer of CP/M software, and recommended using the CP/M operating system to partner IBM, who were in the process of developing their own home computer. However, digital research the company who created CP/M, were not happy with IBM's contract, leading Microsoft to abandon this plan. They instead purchased 86DOS, an imitation of CP/M that had been designed to take advantage of Intel's new 16-bit 8086 processor, and renamed it to MS-DOS. This was then licensed to IBM, who used it in their 1981 product, the IBM PC. Powered by a cheaper version of the 8086, the 8088, it was an instant success, and the MS-DOS operating system quickly overtook CP/M in market share. The proliferation of different microprocessors and architectures created a golden age of home computer technology in the early 1980s. The adoption of computers rapidly increased in both home, education, and in the workplace. However, by 1985, IBM were clearly ahead. More than half of the home computers in America were IBM's. The original IBM PC had sold well, but the recently released PC-AT led the industry with its blazing fast Intel 8286 CPU. The PC-AT was so fast that IBM had to purposely slow down the chip to not cannibalize its mini-computer line. Faced with dwindling sales of 8-bit computers, others in the industry needed a microprocessor that could keep up. Thankfully, this already existed. Introduced in 1980, the Motorola 68K was first used in high-performance systems, such as the HP 9000 series and Silicon Graphics Iris workstations. However, by the middle of the decade, prices had become low enough that use in a personal computer would be cost-effective. The 68K was perfect for the next generation of home computers. Its forward-thinking 32-bit design and high clock speed meant that it was suited to graphics-heavy workloads. It would be the chip to power the Apple Macintosh, the Commodore Amiga, and Atari ST home computers. With IBM PC compatibles dominating the office space, these new machines would position themselves as creative workstations. The Macintosh, by far the most popular of the three, had Aldus PageMaker, a desktop publishing application which allowed the Mac to rule the desktop publishing space. The Amiga had Deluxe Paint, a digital graphics editor, and the Video Toaster, a video production suite. And the Atari, with its built-in MIDI ports, was a music production powerhouse, with software such as Cubase and Logic. By the late 1980s, the market was made up almost entirely of PC compatibles and 68K powered machines. IBM, who had led the market with the PC and PC-AT, did not want to lose its influence, so released a new lineup of computers in 1987 called the PS2 series. The more powerful PS2 machines used the new Intel 8386 CPU and offered a range of new features. One such feature was a new expansion bus called Microchannel Architecture, which was designed to replace the existing ISA bus that had been used on previous IBM machines and PC compatibles. IBM had patented the new bus and charged license fees to companies who wanted to use it. The move was met with poor reception though. It was seen as a desperate attempt to regain control of standards during a time when IBM's grip on the personal computer market had been ever slipping. PS2 machines sold poorly, and PC vendors worked together in a consortium to create standards outside IBM's influence. By 1990, it was clear that IBM had lost control of the industry. Management issues at Atari and Commodore had meant that both companies struggled in the early 1990s, effectively ending support for the Amiga and ST computer lines. This led to a bloom of Mac adoption, with Apple becoming America's #1 computer manufacturer during this time. However, even the newest Apple machines could not compete with the latest PC technology. The Intel 8046, released in 1990, was twice as fast as the outgoing 386. This was achieved by using an inbuilt floating point unit, an on-chip L1 cache, and advanced pipelining. The Motorola 68040, which drove the most powerful Mac systems, could beat the 486 clock for clock, but simply couldn't get to the clock speeds without reaching furnace-like heat output. The market was now segregated into two sectors: the more niche Motorola-powered Macintosh, and the widespread Intel-powered PC. One thing was for certain though: the PC was winning. As computing power increased throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the potential use cases of home computers grew at a similar rate. The 1990s saw an explosion of multimedia software and hardware, which took advantage of the new technology. At the heart of it was the CD-ROM, packing huge amounts of data into a single optical disc. Software titles such as Microsoft Encarta and Myst made full use of the storage that CD-ROMs offered. To power these, a fast processor was a must. It was an age of multimedia madness. Intel, by far the market leader in the PC space, knew that they would need to continue their advancements in order to power this new multimedia age. By late 1992, the company had spent 3 years developing the 486 successor, and didn't want anyone else to profit off it. Up until this point, second sourcing was an almost universal staple of the industry. Multiple manufacturers would produce variants of a company's microprocessor, such that supply was always ensured. However, as Intel entered near monopoly levels of market share, the chipmaker did not want other companies to profit off its new products, and cut all second sourcing agreements. In addition, it also didn't want other CPU manufacturers to use its branding for their advantage. Other companies, such as Cyrix and AMD, had created products which used the 386 and 486 tagline in their brand names. The result of this meant that Intel's new chip would have a new name: the Intel Pentium. The Pentium was launched in early 1993 and was an immediate hit. The chip was blazing fast and blew the doors off anything else on the market. Its dual pipeline design allowed the chip to process simple and complex instructions simultaneously, known as a superscalar architecture. The chip also benefited from a turbocharged floating point unit, which was up to 15 times faster than the one used in the 486. Byte magazine put it best when they ran a double-page spread saying "Pentium changes the PC," indicating that the Pentium was so fast it would be bottlenecked by other system components. In fact, this was the Pentium's biggest problem. The other components RAM, storage, display adapter, weren't ready to take advantage of the Pentium's true performance, and the need for the latest hardware meant the cost of Pentium machines was prohibitively expensive. This created heightened demand for 486 machines, and allowed Intel's competition to flourish. The AMD AM486 and Cyrix CX486 were two microprocessors that had been reverse engineered from Intel's part. These processors performed at roughly the same level as Intel's 486, but were cheaper. For example, a 40 MHz AM486 cost the same as a 33 MHz Intel 486. This competition continued, and although it would take several years, both AMD and Cyrix came up with Pentium competitors. The AMD K5 and Cyrix 6X86 were both released in 1996, delivering Pentium performance at a lower price. Things were looking good for the market, until one application changed everything. Quake was the hottest PC game of 1996, and was a visual marvel. Quake's levels guided players through a fully texture-mapped 3D world, rendered in real time. To power such a feat, a Pentium processor was a must. id Software had taken maximum advantage of Pentium-specific optimizations, and the game heavily relied on floating point calculations. Up until this time, almost all applications relied exclusively on integer maths, where the 686 and K5 could beat the Pentium. In Quake, however, they couldn't come close. Cyrix was hit particularly hard, as its floating point performance was extremely weak in comparison to Intel's. The chipmaker was soon relegated to producing low-cost products for entry-level machines, and the company merged with National Semiconductor in 1997, ending its x86 development. This issue didn't hurt AMD in anywhere near the same extent though. This was due to the chipmaker acquiring NextGen, another semiconductor company who had produced 486 class CPUs for PCs. NextGen had been working on the successor to their own Pentium competitor, the NX586, and this design would become the basis for AMD's new processor. The result was the AMD K6, which would release in 1997. Despite launching 4 years after the Pentium, the chip could match the very best on the market. To keep on top of the industry, Intel had intended the Pentium to be replaced with the Pentium Pro in 1995, thus extending their performance lead. The Pentium Pro used an advanced architecture called P6, which put heavy emphasis on improved 32-bit performance, but suffered in 16-bit applications. This was a problem, since Intel had overestimated the amount of 32-bit code that would be used in Windows 95 and its applications, resulting in the Pentium Pro delivering no real performance gain over the Pentium. This meant that by 1997, 4 years after the Pentium had launched, it was still the company's fastest chip. The bad news for Intel was that AMD's K6 was fast, faster than an equivalent Pentium, and cost less. The K6 architecture was vastly superior to the K5s, and the chip was a huge success. Feeling the heat, Intel released the Pentium 2 the same year, which used the same architecture as the Pentium Pro, but with a number of improvements and cost reductions. The Pentium 2 was fast, but it wasn't a leap forward that the Pentium had been. While the chip was faster in floating point applications, AMD's K6 and its successor, the K6-2, were faster in integer performance. This meant for gaming, Intel was ahead, but for everyone else, you could just save the money and get a K6. Intel's competition was not limited to the x86 space, however. Apple, who were the last remaining manufacturer of 68K computers in the early 90s, saw the rapid performance increases of Wintel PCs and knew that they had to look to a new architecture in order to keep up. Motorola, who had built the 68K, also knew that their architecture would not last the next 10 years. To combat Intel, Apple and Motorola teamed up with IBM to produce a brand new RISC-based microarchitecture called PowerPC. The RISC philosophy, standing for Reduced Instruction Set Computing, aimed to simplify the low-level micro-operations that made up computer programs. The RISC instruction set had far fewer instructions than the CISC instruction set found in x86 machines, meaning that in theory, architectural improvements would be easier to design and implement. Many in the 1990s believed that RISC instruction sets were the future, and that the complex nature of a CISC architecture would limit its potential. It was during this time that many RISC architectures were developed, including PowerPC, UltraSpark from Sun, and Intel's Itanium. Power was first introduced on the desktop in 1994 with Apple's Power Macintosh line, and provided a much-needed performance boost to Apple's family. The first PowerPC chip, the 601, was up to 3 times faster than the Motorola 68040 CPU that it replaced. The performance improvements continued, with the PowerPC 750 launching in 1997. The chip, branded by Apple as the G3, was the fastest CPU in the world, and solidified the idea that RISC was the architecture of the future. The chip was up to 30% faster than the Pentium 2 in some applications, and due to its low power usage, meant that Apple's laptops would easily outperform Intel equivalents. Intel was starting to feel pressure from competition on both the PC and Mac side, and by early 1999, AMD had overtaken them in sales. The response? The Pentium 3. Considered by many to be a rebrand, early Pentium 3s were nothing more than Pentium 2s, but with a new cache controller and Intel's new SSE instructions. SSE allowed the CPU to drive the floating point unit as a vector processor, allowing a program to do a calculation on 4 floating point numbers in the time it would take to do 1. This technology had been introduced by AMD on the K6-2, called 3D Now, but it was not widely adopted, and Intel's adaptation would become the industry standard. The Pentium 3 was the fastest x86 CPU on release, but only briefly. AMD would release the Athlon in late 1999, a chip that was definitively faster than the Pentium 3. The Athlon was ahead in integer calculations, but even further ahead in floating point. Intel responded with a whole host of modifications to the Pentium 3 core, including introducing an on-board L2 cache. These second-generation Pentium 3 CPUs were known as Coppermine, and while they were not faster than the Athlon clock for clock, they had far better motherboard support and used less power. They should have been big sellers, but they weren't. Intel was in the process of transitioning from the 250 to 180 nanometer manufacturing node, and this transition was fraught with problems. A 1 GHz Coppermine Pentium 3 would just about outperform a first generation Athlon, but you just couldn't buy the Intel part. Stock was severely limited, and faced with no other choice, retailers and OEMs were forced to build Athlon PCs. To further boost performance, AMD refreshed the Athlon by moving the cache to be on die, like the Coppermine Pentium 3s, which allowed them to crank up the clock speeds all the way to 1.4 GHz. With continued lack of supply of Pentium 3s, AMD invested in another manufacturing plant in Germany to keep up with demand. The news got worse for Intel, because it was around this time that the PowerPC 7400, more commonly known as the G4, was released. The G4 was the first PowerPC chip to implement SSC-like features called UltraVec, and performance easily overtook x86 CPUs in PCs, even at low clock speeds. Intel released the Pentium 4 in late 2000, but it was clear that the product had been rushed to market, as it was power-hungry, hot, and slow. Not only could the Pentium 4 not match the Athlons, it couldn't even match AMD's budget-friendly Duron CPUs. In early 2002, the product was updated to include more cache, support faster memory, and included higher clock speeds. Using Intel's new 130nm process, the chip could now clock fast enough to beat AMD's flagship, which had been renamed Athlon XP. However, with upcoming launches from PowerPC and AMD, it was clear that the performance crown would not be held for long. The multimedia-driven 1990s had seen a paradigm shift in the design of CPUs. An emphasis on floating point performance meant that by the turn of the millennium, processors were equipped to handle high-resolution displays, complex creative applications, and rich 3D graphics. But with the clock speed wall soon approaching, the next 20 years would be defined by packaging multiple CPU cores onto a single die. While the previous 25 years was based around ever-growing clock speeds, these new designs would require a whole new way of thinking. This was the era of the multicore mindset. The year is 2002. And with Intel's mainstream and workstation performance behind its rival, AMD, the company attempted to boost performance with a new technology called hyperthreading. Hyperthreading was an implementation of SMT, or simultaneous multithreading, a technique that created an additional virtual processor, which allowed applications to take advantage of underused parts of the processing pipeline. This was first seen in new Intel Xeon workstation processors, which replaced the Pentium 3 Xeons which occupied the space. The technology was used to close the performance gap to the AMD Athlon MP, a dual-socket version of the Athlon XP. The feature was brought to the desktop with the high-end Pentium 4 CPUs in May 2003. This, combined with a super-fast 800 MHz front-side bus, meant that the Pentium pulled ahead of the Athlon XP. AMD responded by releasing the Athlon 64, the first 64-bit x86 CPU. The processor was based on AMD's Opteron server CPU, which had been released earlier in the year. At first, the achievement didn't seem that impressive. There were other 64-bit CPUs around. Many RISC architectures had reached the 64-bit milestone far earlier. It wasn't even the first 64-bit desktop CPU. The PowerMac G5, powered by the PowerPC 970, had been released 3 months prior. But none of this mattered, because AMD's architecture could do what no other architecture could: run both 64 and 32-bit x86 applications at full speed. There was another architecture that could run both: Intel's Itanium, which was a RISC-based 64-bit CPU that featured a 32-bit x86 compatibility layer. The Itanium, however, suffered huge performance penalties when running 32-bit x86 code. The Athlon's architecture didn't. Intel tried to combat AMD's press coverage by announcing a fully unlocked version of the Pentium 4, the Pentium 4 Extreme Edition. This quickly gained the nickname Emergency Edition, due to its sudden announcement being conveniently a week before the Athlon 64's release. The initial launch of the Athlon was somewhat mixed. The chip was the fastest out there, no question. But it was expensive, and the requirement to use buffered memory on high-end Athlon 64 FX products added further costs. There were also production issues. At launch, AMD could only produce 100,000 chips a month. These problems eventually ironed out, and the Athlon 64 sold well. While the Pentium 4 was fast for content creation workloads, in gaming, the Athlon 64 and 64FX were far ahead. Revisions of the Pentium 4 and Athlon 64 chips were rolled out throughout 2004 and early 2005. But while the Pentium 4 remained competitive, the product was suffering from high power draw and temperatures as Intel cranked the clock speeds higher and higher. The true step forward was met in 2005 with the release of the dual-core Pentium D and Athlon 64 X2. The Pentium D was essentially two Pentium 4 processors on the same package, whereas the Athlon was a monolithic design, again coming from AMD's work in the server space. The Athlons, just like their single-core counterparts, were faster out the box, but AMD charged a heavy price premium, and with a good overclock, the Pentium could trade blows for far less money. It was clear by now, however, that the Pentium 4 was not a smart design. In an effort to try and continuously improve clock speeds, questionable design decisions were made that would harm the architecture in the long run. The P4's notoriously long 31-stage instruction pipeline made the processor inefficient, and when it was clear that going beyond 4 GHz would be impossible, Intel knew that they had to change the architecture. But things were already looking up for the company. Apple had transitioned away from PowerPC processors to Intel's, making AMD Intel's only competitor in the desktop CPU space. In addition, AMD had become complacent with their performance, using revenue to buy graphics company ATI rather than invest in R&D. Intel decided to base their new architecture on the Pentium M, a mobile chip originally based on the Pentium 3 design. The Pentium M was designed to be as power efficient as possible, and while being based on the Pentium 3, it took many of the improvements from the Pentium 4 and incorporated them into the core. To show that the company was moving away from the Pentium 4 approach, they created a brand new name for their processors: Intel Core. The first Intel Core product was the Intel Core Solo and Intel Core Duo in early 2006. These chips were laptop exclusives and were nothing more than Pentium M processors with minor tweaks. However, ported to a new manufacturing process, they provided class-leading performance and were successful. Their biggest weakness was that they were still only 32-bit chips, but Intel knew that this would be fixed in the next design. And boy, was it a big one. The Core 2 Duo family, released in July 2006, was nothing short of a game changer. The chips, based on Intel's new Conroe architecture, were up to twice as fast as the Pentium Ds they replaced, and crushed the performance of competing Athlon 64 CPUs. The mid-range E6600 was a particular gem. It cost around $320, but was faster than the $900 Athlon FX52, which was AMD's flagship. The chips received glowing reviews in the technology press, citing the high performance, low power consumption, and great value. The architecture had been given a wealth of upgrades, which each gave small single-digit performance increases. The chip itself was given a huge 4 MB of L3 cache, could fuse instructions together to decode more instructions per cycle, and had beefy out-of-order instruction capabilities. When combined together, along with a whole host of other improvements, the chip was a quantum leap in performance. And crucially, AMD had nothing to match it. The company refreshed its lineup with slightly faster Athlons, with much lower prices, but they just weren't fast enough. Furthermore, the launch of Core 2 Quad, a dual-die version of the Core 2 Duo, pushed Intel's technology lead even further ahead. In an age where dual cores were only just being utilised, most people had no need for a quad-core processor. And at a launch price of $850 for the cheapest version, the chip was a niche product. But this didn't matter, because the Halo chip was a demonstration that Intel was king. The Core 2 Quads rapidly dropped in price throughout 2007. 3 months after release, the Q6600, the most popular Core 2 Quad part, had its price reduced by $300. By July, the price had dropped to just $266. AMD finally responded to Intel's lineup in late 2007 with the launch of Phenom. But the chips were overpriced and hit with an architectural bug which dropped performance further. The main problem with Phenom was it simply couldn't clock fast enough. The chips struggled to get past 2.5 GHz. The product was relaunched 6 months later, with the architectural bug fixed, increased clock speeds, and a lower price. The Phenom was now competitive, but only just. Towards the end of 2008 and early 2009, successors from both companies were released. The Core i7 from Intel was launched in late 2008 and offered noticeable performance gains over the Core 2 Quad. But the product was hampered by the requirement for expensive DDR3 memory, and a reduction in L2 cache size meant that some software saw no performance gain. AMD released its new architecture, the Phenom 2, in January 2009 to warm reception. The chip wasn't as fast as the Core i7, but it was competitive with the Core 2 Quads, and could be dropped into the now 3-year-old AM2 motherboards for a cost-effective upgrade. 6-core CPUs came in early 2010, with the Core i7 980X being released by Intel, and the Phenom 2X6 being released by AMD. The i7 was a chip that could do it all. It had impressive multi-threaded performance when applications could use all 6 cores, and blistering single-core speed when they couldn't. The Phenom wasn't so impressive, but thanks to its low price, it was at least competitive. Going into 2011, both AMD and Intel had brand new microarchitectures on the horizon, with Intel detailing its new Sandy Bridge microarchitecture in late 2010. From the surface, Sandy Bridge was an evolution of the Nehalem architecture of the previous Core i7. But under the hood, there were a variety of improvements, which gave it a boost of around 30% over the original Core i7. This was impressive on its own, but the biggest advantage with Sandy Bridge was the affordability. The Core i7 2600K could match the previous flagship, the 6-core i7 980X, but was $700 cheaper at only $317. But the real star was the Core i5 2500K, delivering 90% of the performance of the 2600K at roughly half the price. The chips were given glowing reviews in the tech press. AnandTech called them a no-brainer, and AMD would have to deliver something special to keep up. Early in development, AMD had reported that its upcoming Bulldozer architecture was up to 50% faster than the original Core i7, and many hoped for a return to top-tier performance. Bulldozer was a radical departure from previous designs. In prior architectures, each core got its own caches, units, and interconnects, and were largely independent with one another. In Bulldozer, AMD grouped 2 cores together into a module, which shared some resources, such as the level 2 cache and floating point unit. This compromise was done to try and boost clock speeds of the part, something which had always troubled AMD with the original Phenom. If clock speeds were high enough, then the chip would easily outperform its predecessor. There was just one problem. They weren't. The flagship FX8150 was barely faster than the Phenom 2X6, despite having 8 cores compared to the Phenom 6. In single-threaded workloads, the FX chips were slower than Phenom, and compared to Sandy Bridge, they were hopeless. Because of the lackluster performance, AMD could only price their chips up to a certain point, which meant that revenue started to decrease. At first, it wasn't a problem, with strong GPU sales and sales of Phenom, enabling the company to bring home a net income of $491 million in 2011. But a year later, the company made a net loss of $1.18 billion. AMD were forced to sell its foundries, lay off staff, drastically cut down on R&D, and even sell its headquarters. The company tried to fix the broken architecture, first by cranking up the clock speed, and then gradually modifying the core design. But this did little to help, because Intel's architecture was so far ahead. Faced with no competition, Intel spent almost all of its focus on the mobile market, beefing up the integrated graphics and improving power consumption. This was mainly achieved using the company's unmatched lead in silicon manufacturing. Even if AMD could make a chip as powerful, it would be slower due to Intel's foundry advantage. Intel were dominant for the next 5 years, and faced with no competition, rolled out endless quad cores with slightly higher performance. Sandy Bridge was followed by Ivy Bridge, essentially a die shrink to the 22nm platform. This was followed by Haswell, Broadwell, and then Skylake, each being minor improvements. Many people started to feel like these new chips were lazy upgrades, but with AMD so far behind, people had no choice but to buy them. Faced with bankruptcy, AMD took drastic action. First, most resources were put behind developing a brand new CPU architecture called Zen. This left AMD's graphics lineup vulnerable, but AMD had never really broke through with graphics, and so this was deemed a necessary sacrifice. They beefed up efforts with Microsoft and Sony to produce the hardware for the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 consoles, helping to diversify revenue streams. The company also gained a new CEO in late 2014, Lisa Su, who had joined the company in 2012 from HP Enterprise. With restructuring in place and the company now stable, AMD went into 2017 with great hope. Their new CPU architecture was ready. The Zen core was far more traditional than the Bulldozer concept, reverting back to an independent core design over Bulldozer's modules. It brought new features such as a micro-op cache, simultaneous multi-threading, and a dramatically improved floating point engine. The architecture was also built on the new 14nm FinFET process, which yielded further efficiency gains. The biggest advantage Zen had, however, was its high core count, featuring up to 8 cores on a single Zen die. Launched in early 2017, Ryzen, which was the brand name of the Zen product family, was met with praise from the tech press. The top-end chips were equal in performance to the Intel Core i7-6900K, but the Ryzens were a third the price. While single-threaded performance and clocks were still behind Intel's latest architecture, Kaby Lake, you got twice the cores for the same price. Consumers, who had been stuck with a maximum of 4 cores for the last 11 years, were suddenly shown just how dangerous a monopoly could be. Intel quickly responded, releasing a 6-core mainstream processor, the i7-8700K, 6 months later. The Ryzen family was refreshed in April 2018 with minor tweaks and higher clock speeds, being released as the Ryzen 2000 series. And in October, Intel further increased core count with the Core i9 9900K, which brought 8 cores to Intel's mainstream platform. Intel had hoped to transition products across to their new 10nm node in 2015, but it had been plagued with problems, and even 5 years later, it still wasn't ready for the desktop. The company mitigated this by making continuous improvements to its 14nm process. But AMD, who used TSMC and Samsung foundries, could leap ahead and gain a node advantage. While TSMC's 7nm was only slightly better than Intel's 10nm process, it had great yields and could be used for a desktop-sized die. In July 2019, AMD fully utilised the new node with their Ryzen 3000 family, based on the Zen 2 architecture. The core design was the same as the original Ryzen, but with an improved memory controller and double the L3 cache, significantly improving gaming performance. The Zen 2 architecture also innovated by using a chiplet design, which separated the I/O and compute portions of the chip into 2 distinct dies. This was done because the compute portion gained large benefit when moving to the new expensive process, whereas moving the I/O die saw little benefit. Thus, by separating the dies, the I/O could be manufactured using older and cheaper lithographies without impacting performance. This chiplet design allowed AMD to double the core count, bringing 16 cores to the mainstream desktop. Stuck on its 14nm process, Intel could only increase core count by 25%, releasing its 10-core i9 10900K in May 2020. So what's next? Since 2005, we've hit a wall with clock speeds, being limited by power draw and heat dissipation. Furthermore, as the process nodes shrink, the cost to develop new chips is growing at an exponential rate. In 2001, when the Pentium 4 was first introduced, there were 23 foundries who were manufacturing the bleeding-edge 130nm process. With the latest 7nm node, only 3 are left: Intel, Samsung, and TSMC. With these limitations, the future of x86 looks underwhelming. More cores, bigger caches, minor architectural improvements, but 50% increases in performance, you can forget it. To keep pushing boundaries, it will require truly groundbreaking innovation. But that's exactly how we got here in the first place. Today, the PC processor industry is dominated by AMD and Intel, with essentially 100% market share in laptops, home computers, and servers. But in televisions, infotainment systems, smart devices, and particularly in smartphones, they have almost zero market influence. So why is there such a divide between these two markets? It's not performance. Modern smartphones are just as powerful as home computers. Discovering the answer is critical in understanding why the home computer industry is becoming armed and dangerous. To find it, we need to go back to 1981. This was at the beginning of the home computer revolution, and Acorn computers were a key player in the UK. Their first computer, the Atom, was a minor hit, but the real success came with the follow-up. The company had signed a deal with the BBC to produce a computer for a series of educational programs as part of the broadcaster's computer literacy program. The computer was developed quickly and was released as the BBC Micro, which went on to become one of the best-selling home computers of the period. Its success was linked to the education market. As part of the program, the government subsidised computers in schools by offering 50% off, provided that they chose one of three models: the BBC Micro, Sinclair's ZX Spectrum, or RM380Z from Oxford company Research Machines. The Micro was the obvious choice, however, since it was the machine that was featured in the BBC television programmes. To capitalise on their success, and to address the lower end of the market being dominated by Sinclair products, Acorn released the Electron, a cost-reduced version of the BBC Micro. During this time, Acorn engineers began to think about a next-generation machine, but found existing 16-bit microchips, such as the Motorola 68K, to be lacking. The company therefore decided to start development on an in-house solution called the Acorn RISC machine, which was based on the reduced instruction set idea that would become popular in the late 1990s. The project resulted in the ARM1 microprocessor, which was mainly used as a coprocessor to speed up the development of the ARM2. The ARM2 would be used in the Acorn Archimedes, the successor to the BBC Master, a more powerful version of the BBC Micro. The machine saw success in education, but most people chose to upgrade their 8-bit machines with either an Amiga or an Atari ST, and the Archimedes never saw mainstream success. Acorn partnered with semiconductor manufacturer VLSI, and faced with poor sales of the Archimedes, they were asked to find partners to use the ARM chip. This led to the venture being spun off as a separate company, ARM Holdings. The venture was split three ways. One third was controlled by Acorn, another third by VLSI, and the final third by Apple, who wanted to use the chip in its upcoming Newton Message Pad PDA. Despite the venture, sales of the ARM chips were initially poor, with manufacturers hesitant to use its expensive 32-bit design. In 1993, the company was approached by Texas Instruments, who wanted to license their instruction set and produce their own version. ARM accepted, and this idea led the company to create its licensing business model, where the company would produce the instruction set and core designs, but let other companies produce the final hardware. The business model turned out to be a smart move, as the company was able to capitalize on the emerging mobile phone market. In 1998, the company was floated on the stock market and were generating a net income of £3 million a year. Despite a dip in the dot-com crash, the company continued to grow. The advantage of the licensing model was that companies would modify the architecture to suit particular products, allowing a huge amount of flexibility for device manufacturers. The rise of the early smartphone market, led by devices such as the BlackBerry Quark and Palm Treo, further grew ARM's market share. The launch of the Apple iPhone in 2007 and the Android operating system in 2008 led to an explosion in the smartphone market, which dramatically improved the company's profit. By 2012, the company had a 96% share of the mobile phone market. So, in the mobile space, you've got a familiar architecture, consistent instruction set improvements, and cheap licensing costs. On the desktop, an x86 duopoly, where the market leader has a broken 10nm process, and its competitor having an inconsistent record in delivering performance. If you want to develop a new in-house processor for a smartphone, the only cost is licensing the architecture and modifying the chip. If you want a new processor for a laptop, you've got to pay a hefty price for the newest Intel chip, which is slow and suffers from high power draw compared to the ARM designs. It's unsurprising then to learn that the home and server markets are slowly moving to ARM. Cost is not the only advantage. ARM has been a pioneer of heterogeneous computing, the idea that different types of processor cores should be used for different purposes. The big little concept, which has been widely adopted in smartphones, splits the CPU into 2 or more clusters, which scale from low power to high performance. Additionally, the flexibility of the ARM instruction set means that manufacturers can tailor chips from device to device. Buying an Intel CPU means you get a predetermined amount of compute performance, power consumption, SIMD capabilities, and graphics horsepower. With ARM, all of these can be easily modified. Moving from x86 to ARM won't be easy. The instruction sets are not compatible with each other, and software will need to be recompiled or run in software emulation, where performance can be dramatically reduced. But many manufacturers of computers also have strong mobile divisions, which will aid this transition. Apple, LG, Microsoft, Samsung, and Lenovo all have strong experience in developing for ARM platforms, making the transition easier. ARM-powered laptops have been an emerging market for several years, particularly spurred on by Microsoft's support of Windows 10 to the ARM platform. The Surface Pro X, powered by the Microsoft SQ1 SoC, is a notable example. However, the desktop landscape has been void of ARM-powered systems since Acorn's death in the late 1990s. But even this is changing. In June 2020, Apple announced that it would be moving its entire Mac family away from Intel to Apple-designed ARM silicon. The A12Z, which powers the Developer Transition Kit, is the first desktop ARM CPU in the modern era. Furthermore, all new Apple computers will be running ARM chips by 2022. The significance of this event, combined with the advantages of using the ARM instruction sets, means that it is likely more and more vendors will start transitioning across. The CISC x86 instruction set may have killed off its RISC competition 20 years prior, but now is its time to be retired. It may seem like a drastic move, but as microprocessor development costs increase and progress becomes ever more certain, big changes are needed. ARM may be what the industry needs. We've experienced 75 years of rapid technological development, and the progress of the microprocessor has changed the world. While companies have come and gone, the pace of innovation has been relentless. From the dawn of post-war computing to a home computer revolution. A multimedia frenzy, followed by an explosion of multi-core computing. But with costs spiraling and facing a brick wall of power consumption, we must ask, is this it? Thank you very much for watching.